Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are attempting something a little ambitious, I think.
Just a little.
We're not just looking at a person. We are trying to decode the DNA of, well, the American sound. You know, when you close your eyes and you picture the 20th century, the skyscrapers, the steam, the absolute kinetic energy of New York City, there is a soundtrack playing in your mind.
Oh, absolutely. It's ubiquitous. It's in elevators, movie trailers, jazz clubs, concert halls.
Right.
I mean, you hear that one specific clarinet slide, that opening wail, and you know exactly where you are.
You're there instantly. And usually we just nod and say, oh, that's Gershwin. But I wanted to move past that polite appreciation today. I was digging through the biographical records you sent over, and the thing that just jumped out at me wasn't the tuxedo-wearing genius at the piano. It was the grit.
The grit is the entire story. If you miss the grit, you miss the music.
Exactly. We're sold this image of a polished, high society figure.
Right, sipping champagne.
But the reality is a high school dropout from Brooklyn, a kid who grew up on the streets, literally roller skating through tenements, who somehow managed to fuse the synagogue, the jazz club, and the classical concert hall into one single voice.
It's a remarkable, almost impossible convergence. And I think what we're going to explore today isn't just a list of his greatest hits. We're going to look at the relentless hustle that got him there.
Yes.
We're also going to talk about this shocking thread of insecurity that followed him his whole life, this feeling that he wasn't educated enough.
Which is wild.
And of course, we have to talk about the tragic, almost cinematic medical mystery that cut his life short. I mean, at just 38 years old.
That part is just devastating. He was just getting started. But before we get to the end, we have to start at the beginning. And honestly, it starts with a classic immigrant tale.
It absolutely does. And to understand George, you have to understand the chaotic, vibrant world he was born into. We're talking about the late 1890s. His parents, Moish Gershwin and Rosa Bruskina, they arrive in New York. They're Jewish immigrants fleeing the Russian Empire, specifically from around the Lithuania and Russia regions.
And like so many families at that time, the name didn't exactly survive the crossing intact, did it? It was a much more fluid identity.
Fluid is a polite way to put it. It was about survival, about assimilation. The grandfather, Yakov, had been a mechanic in the Imperial Russian Army, which, was a really rare thing for a Jew to be allowed to do for 25 years.
Wow.
But when his son, Moishe, came to New York, specifically to avoid that same military service, the name Gershwin started to shift. It evolved first into Gershwin.
Gershwin with an E at the end.
Exactly. And eventually, once George entered the professional music world, it was smoothed out, anglicized to the Gershwin we all know today.
And George himself wasn't even born George.
No, he was born Jacob Gershwin, September 26, 1898, in a second-floor apartment on Snedeker Avenue in Brooklyn.
Which was basically the Yiddish theater district at the time, right? That whole area.
Oh, deep in that world. It was loud, it was crowded, and just bursting with this cultural friction. And here is the real kicker. George wasn't some quiet prodigy studying Bach in a corner.
No, not at all. This is my favorite part of his early life. The sources all described him as, well, kind of a bad boy.
A street kid through and through.
He was running around with his friends, getting into trouble, roller skating all over the place. Music just wasn't even on his radar.
Not even a little bit. In fact, he famously said he thought boys who played music were sissies. If there was supposed to be a musical prodigy in the Gershwin family, it was his older brother, Ira.
Ah, poor Ira, the designated intellectual.
Well, it actually worked out pretty well for Ira in the end, becoming one of the greatest lyricists ever. But the story is just perfect. The parents bought a piano specifically for him, for Ira.
A huge investment for a family like that.
A massive investment. They had to hoist this thing into their tenement apartment through the window because the stairs were too narrow. And the expectation was the older, studious brother would take lessons.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. The moment the piano arrives, 10-year-old George sits down and just starts playing.
Just like that. He'd never touched a keyboard.
Well, it turns out he'd been secretly teaching himself on a friend's player piano down the street.
Yeah.
But yeah, from that moment on, he completely monopolized the instrument.
And Ira was probably thrilled.
Ira was so relieved. He had zero interest. But George was obsessed. And there was a very specific catalyst for this sudden obsession.
The violin recital.
Violin recital, exactly. When he was about 10, he was standing outside a school auditorium window, apparently in the rain, and he heard his friend, a kid named Maxie Rosenzweig, play a violin recital.
Do we know what he played?
Dvorak's Humoresque. And something about that sound, the raw emotional connection of it, just flipped a switch in George's brain.
It's amazing. He goes from being a kid who only cares about street games to a kid you can't tear away from the piano.
And because he started late, and because he was mostly self-taught at first, he didn't have the rules drilled into him. He didn't know what you supposedly weren't allowed to do with music.
Which brings us to his real education. Because it wasn't a conservatory, it wasn't Juilliard, he went to work.
And this is absolutely crucial to understanding his style. At 15 years old, in 1913, he drops out of the High School of Commerce. He walks away from formal education to take a job at a place called Jerome H. Remick and Company.
On Tin Pan Alley.
The heart of it all.
We hear that name, Tin Pan Alley, all the time, but I think we need to really paint the picture. This wasn't some pristine recording studio.
Oh, God, no. It was a factory, a noise factory. Imagine a narrow street in Manhattan just lined with music publishing houses. And inside each one, you have dozens of tiny rooms, basically cubicles, with paper-thin walls.
And every single room.
A piano's being hammered on all day long.
And his job title was song plugger.
Which is such a quaint term for what was a pretty brutal job.
So what did he do?
Think of him as a human Spotify preview button. This is before radio was dominant, before records are cheap. If you wanted to hear a new song to decide if you wanted to buy the sheet music, someone had to play it for you.
So he's the guy.
He's the guy. Singers, vaudeville performers, band leaders, they'd come in, and George would sit in this tiny, smoke-filled cubicle. They called them sweat boxes. And he would play the company's new songs over and over, trying to convince people to buy the sheet music.
For how much money?
$15 a week. It was an absolute grind. You have to imagine the acoustics. He's trying to play a sentimental ballad in F major, and through the wall on his left, someone is hammering out a ragtime number in B flat.
And on the right, someone's shouting lyrics.
Exactly. It has to do something to your brain. It rewires you completely. You learn to be percussive. You learn to be rhythmic just to cut through the noise.
So that driving piano style of his.
It was born there. That powerful, almost piston-like left hand he was known for, that wasn't delicate conservatory playing. That was commercial, aggressive, rhythmic playing designed to be heard over a dozen other pianos.
He was basically hacking the system just to be heard. And he wasn't only plugging songs, he was recording them too. The piano rolls.
You know, to supplement that $15 a week, he started recording piano rolls for player pianos. He cranked out dozens, maybe hundreds of them.
And under fake names.
He had to. He was doing so many for different competing companies, so he used pseudonyms.
I love the names. Fred Murtha?
Fred Murtha, Bert Wynn.
Fred Murtha sounds like an accountant.
Doesn't he? But it just shows you he was a working musician, a gig economy worker of the 1910s. And those roles are fascinating because they capture exactly how he played before he became George Gershwin, the great composer.
How so?
It's fast, it's frantic, technically dazzling. He was dissecting popular music, seeing how it was built, and then physically punching that information into these rolls of paper.
So he's grinding away, just soaking up every style of music floating around New York. Ragtime, blues, show tunes, everything. When does he finally break through? When does he stop selling other people's songs and start selling his own?
Well, it happened surprisingly fast. He had a few little novelty songs. His first published tune earned him exactly 50 cents, which he apparently framed. But the big explosion, the moment everything changes, is 1919, a song called Swanee.
Swanee. Now, this is interesting because when you listen to Swanee today, it sounds very old-fashioned. It doesn't sound like the sophisticated, jazzy Gershwin we think of.
No, it's very much of its time. It definitely has roots in the minstrel show tradition, which was standard pop culture back then. But the breakthrough wasn't just the song itself. It was the distribution channel.
The Al Jolson connection.
The Al Jolson connection.
Yeah.
George was at a party, hustling as always, playing his songs for anyone who'd listen. And Al Jolson, who was the biggest star on Broadway at the time, happened to hear it.
Jolson in 1919 was like, I don't know, Drake and Taylor Swift combined.
He was absolutely massive.
Yeah.
Jolson loved the rhythm, loved the energy. He decided to put it in his traveling show, Sinbad. And just like that, Swanee isn't just a song anymore. It's a national phenomenon.
How big did it get?
It sold millions of copies of sheet music and records. It put Gershwin on the map, both financially and professionally. He was 21 years old and suddenly wealthy. But here's the key shift. Swanee was a pop hit. George wanted to do something more.
This brings us to the piece that really changed everything. The piece that marks the transition from songwriter to composer, 1924, Rhapsody in Blue.
The context for this is just legendary. Paul Whiteman, a very famous band leader who marketed himself as the King of Jazz.
Which is a whole other
A
conversation.
very complicated title, yes.
Yeah.
But he wanted to put on a concert at Aeolian Hall in New York called An Experiment in Modern Music.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was to show that jazz could be respectable, that it could be elevated to the concert hall.
Which, in retrospect, sounds a little patronizing, doesn't it? The idea that jazz needed to be elevated by putting it in a tuxedo.
Oh, completely. It was largely about sanitizing and packaging jazz for a white concert-going audience. But for Gershwin, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He was commissioned to write a concerto-like piece for a piano and jazz band.
And he had lots of time to prepare, I assume.
Almost none. The story goes that Whiteman actually announced the concert with Gershwin's new piece on the program in the newspaper before Gershwin had even formally agreed to write it.
As he's on a deadline from hell.
A brutal, brutal deadline. He wrote the initial two-piano sketch in just a matter of weeks while he was also working on a Broadway show. He famously said the ideas came to him on a train ride to Boston, inspired by the steely rhythms of the train.
And he didn't even orchestrate it himself, did he?
Not initially. That was done by Fer de Groffet, who was Whiteman's brilliant in-house arranger. Gershwin wrote the melodies, the harmonies, the structure, the soul of the piece, but Groffet was the one who decided which instruments played which notes.
But the opening, that iconic clarinet wail, surely that was Gershwin.
That was actually a happy accident. In the original score, it was just written as a simple 17-note scale.
No.
Yes. But during a rehearsal, the clarinetist, Ross Gorman, was just fooling around and played it as a joke. This long, sliding, kind of sleazy glissando. Gershwin heard it across the hall and shouted, "Keep that in! Do it as much as possible."
And an icon was born. It sounds like a siren. It sounds like the city waking up.
It's the sound of the 20th century. And when it premiered, it was an absolute sensation. You have that opening, and then it launches into this breathtaking fusion of, Tchaikovsky-style romanticism and the syncopated rhythms of the jazz age.
It established him as something new.
It established him as a unique figure, someone who could walk in both worlds, a bridge between the street and the concert hall.
But the success brings up something really surprising in the source material. You would think, after Rhapsody in Blue, Gershwin would be walking on air. He'd be the most confident guy in the room.
You'd think so.
But the sources talk about this intense, crippling imposter syndrome.
It's one of the most humanizing things about him. Here he is, arguably the most famous and successful composer in America, and he was deeply, deeply insecure about his lack of formal training.
He felt like a fake.
He felt like a fake because he hadn't gone to a conservatory. He was terrified that the classical establishment looked down on him as just a tunesmith, a guy who could write a catchy jingle but didn't really understand musical architecture or counterpoint.
So he spent years trying to find someone to teach him. And the people he asked, these are the titans of classical music.
It's a who's who of 20th century music. He goes to Paris and asks to study with Nadia Boulanger.
The most famous composition teacher in the world. She taught Aaron Copland, Philip Glass, Quincy Jones, everybody.
And she turned him down flat.
Why? Did she think he wasn't good enough?
It was the complete opposite. She said, essentially, I have nothing to teach you. She was afraid that rigorous academic European training would actually ruin his natural jazz-influenced style. She didn't want to fix him and, in the process, break the magic.
Don't mess with the formula.
Exactly. And then there's the story with Maurice Ravel.
This is my favorite anecdote in all of music history.
It's the best. So Gershwin goes to Ravel and asks for lessons. Ravel, very shrewdly, asks Gershwin how much money he makes in a year.
And Gershwin tells him, and it's some staggering amount, hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1920s money.
And Ravel just looks at him and says, "You should give me lessons."
It's funny, but it's also so profound. Ravel famously told him, why become a second-rate Ravel when you're already a first-rate Gershwin?
Even Arnold Schoenberg, the father of atonal, 12-tone, incredibly complex modernism, he and Gershwin were friends in Hollywood. They played tennis together.
I cannot picture that.
I know. But when Gershwin asked him for lessons, Schoenberg basically said the same thing. I would only make you a bad Schoenberg, and you're such a good Gershwin.
It seems like all these classical masters understood his value better than he did himself in those moments.
Wow.
They saw the vitality he had.
They envied his melodic gift. They saw that he had captured the American voice, the sound of his time, in a way they never could. But George never quite shook that feeling that he needed to improve, to become more legitimate.
So he keeps pushing. He writes An American in Paris in 1928, which is this incredible tone poem. He actually brought back real taxi horns from Paris to use in the orchestra, right?
He did. He went to the auto shops on the Champs-Élysées and bought actual Parisian taxi horns with the little rubber bulbs. He wanted sonic realism. It's impressionistic, it's like Debussy, but it's got that undeniable American swagger.
But the real gamble, the massive artistic risk, comes in the mid-1930s. We have to talk about Porgy and Bess.
This is his magnum opus. And it's so important to understand how radical this was. Up until this point, Gershwin is the king of the 3-minute pop song and the 15-minute jazz concerto. Porgy and Bess is a full-scale 3-hour opera.
Or a folk opera, as he insisted on calling it.
Right. And the research and preparation for this was incredibly intense. He didn't just sit in his Manhattan penthouse and imagine what African-American life in the South was like. In the summer of 1934, he physically moved to Folly Island, South Carolina, right near Charleston.
He lived there.
He did. He immersed himself in the Gullah community there. He went to their church services. He listened to the street vendors. He absorbed the rhythms of their speech, the spirituals, the shouting patterns. He wasn't just quoting folk tunes. He was trying to internalize a musical language so he could write original music that felt authentic to that culture.
And he's working with his brother Ira, of course, and DuBose Hayward, who wrote the original novel, Porgy.
It was a massive collaboration.
Yeah.
But when it finally premiered in 1935, the reception was, well, it was confusing for people.
The critics just didn't know what to do with it.
Exactly. The opera critics from the big papers said, this sounds too much like Broadway. It's not a real opera. And the theater critics said, this is too heavy. Why is everyone singing all the time?
So it was a commercial failure.
Initially, yes, a financial flop. It closed without making back its investment, which was a huge blow to Gershwin.
And that's just wild to think about now, considering it contains Summertime, I Got Plenty of Nuttin'. It ain't necessarily so. These are some of the most famous songs ever written.
Summertime alone has been recorded, something like 25,000 times officially. It's a standard of standards. But at the time, it was seen as this genre-bending thing that people weren't ready for. The historian Robert Kimball noted that it has always been outside category.
It's in that space between high art and popular entertainment.
Which is exactly where Gershwin always lived.
So Porgy and Bess flops financially. Gershwin is feeling the sting, so what does he do? He goes where the money is, he heads west.
He heads to Hollywood. It's 1936. The Great Depression is still raging, but the movie musical business is booming. And despite the disappointment of Porgy, George and Ira are treated like absolute royalty out there.
They set up shop in Beverly Hills.
They did. Rented a beautiful house with a tennis court, a swimming pool, and on the surface, this looks like a golden period. He's playing that tennis with Schoenberg. He's writing these incredible scores for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies like Shall We Dance?
And the output is just staggering. They can't take that away from me. Let's call the whole thing off a foggy day. These standards just flowed out of him.
It seemed effortless. But underneath this sunny California lifestyle, something was going very, very wrong.
This is where the story turns from a musical biography into a medical mystery. And it starts with something so specific and strange.
The smell.
The smell.
Early in 1937, George starts complaining to his friends and family about smelling burning rubber.
Olfactory hallucinations.
Exactly. And there had been a mention of him smelling burning garbage once before, way back in 1934, but now it was persistent. And along with the smell came these blinding, debilitating headaches.
But he keeps trying to work. I mean, he's George Gershwin. The hustle never stops.
He tries to. But then there's a very public, very frightening incident. He's in San Francisco performing his piano concerto in F with a symphony orchestra.
A piece he's played countless times.
A piece he knows backwards and forwards. And this is a guy with rock-solid rhythm, incredible muscle memory. And suddenly, in the middle of the performance, he blacks out for a moment. He loses coordination. He starts missing cues.
That must have been absolutely terrifying for him.
It was. And back at home in L.A., his behavior starts to change dramatically. He's having mood swings. He's spilling food at dinner, unable to use utensils properly. He can't play the piano without hitting wrong notes.
And this is where the tragedy is compounded by a terrible misunderstanding.
It is. His sister-in-law, Leonore Ira's wife, and others in his circle, they suspected it was mental illness.
They thought it was stress. Hysteria from overwork.
They thought it was psychosomatic. Maybe the stress of Hollywood, maybe a deep depression from the failure of Porgy and Bess. They actually had him see a psychoanalyst, and at one point, they moved him out of the main house into lyricist Yparberg's guest quarters to be cared for by a valet. They thought he just needed peace and quiet.
They were treating a massive brain tumor with rest and relaxation.
It's heartbreaking.
Okay.
But it wasn't mental illness. It was terrifyingly physical. On the morning of July 9, 1937, he collapses into a coma while working on the score for a new movie, The Goldwyn Follies.
He's rushed to the hospital.
Rushed to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. And finally, the doctors do a spinal tap and realize the pressure inside his skull is enormous. It's a tumor. A glioblastoma, a very aggressive kind.
And the story of the attempt to save him, it sounds like something out of a movie script.
It really does. The local surgeons knew they were out of their depth. They identified the top neurosurgeon in the country at the time, a Dr. Walter Dandy from Johns Hopkins.
But Dandy isn't at his hospital.
No. He's on a yacht, fishing in the Chesapeake Bay with the governor of Maryland. Completely unreachable.
So you have George Gershwin dying in Los Angeles, and the one person who might be able to save him is on a boat 3,000 miles away.
The White House actually got involved. They dispatched a Coast Guard cutter to intercept the governor's yacht. They literally pull Dr. Dandy off the boat, rush him to shore where a police escort is waiting, get him to an airport, and charter a plane to fly him across the country.
The desperation is just unbelievable.
But this is 1937. Propeller planes are slow. Before Dandy could even get there, the doctors in L.A. realized they couldn't wait any longer. Gershwin was fading. They decided they had to operate themselves.
And it was too late.
The tumor was too advanced, too deep, too entangled. George Gershwin died on the operating table on the morning of July 11, 1937.
He was 38 years old.
38. It's just gut-wrenching to think about. The writer John O'Hara summed up the shock of it so perfectly. He wrote, "George Gershwin died on July 11, 1937, but I don't have to believe that if I don't want to."
It just felt impossible. He was so full of life. He was the energy of America personified. And then just silence.
Silence.
So let's look at what happened after the silence. Because he left behind this absolutely massive legacy.
The legacy is staggering. I mean, just from a financial standpoint, a study by The Guardian back in 2005 estimated that he was the wealthiest composer of all time, based on accrued earnings.
And that's partly because his estate was very aggressive about protecting his copyrights, right? The Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act.
Yes, the Gershwin estate was one of the major supporters of that act, which kept works like Rhapsody in Blue under protection for decades longer than they would have been. His music remained incredibly lucrative because it was, and is, everywhere.
But beyond the money, let's go back and analyze the style. We threw around the term melting pot earlier, but what really is the Gershwin sound composed of? What are the ingredients?
It's really a specific triad of influences. First, and most importantly, you have the African-American influence. The syncopation of ragtime and the blue notes of the blues, that flattened third and seventh note of the scale. That's the rhythmic engine.
Okay.
Second, you have what some scholars call the aching cadences of Hebrew cantorial chants from the synagogue. That provides a lot of the emotional weight, that sort of crying quality you hear in his melodies.
And the third piece?
The third is the lush, complex harmonies of French Impressionism. He adored Debussy and Ravel, the extended chords, the ninths, the 11ths, the 13ths. That's where he gets his color palette.
And he just mashed them all together?
He synthesized them into something new. And he also brought a kind of mathematical precision to it. We mentioned he was always trying to learn. In his later years, he studied with a theorist named Joseph Schillinger, who taught a very complex mathematical system of composition.
Which was controversial, right? Some people tried to claim that Schillinger basically wrote Porgy and Bess.
Ira Gershwin furiously denied that, and most scholars agree it's nonsense. Schillinger may have given George some new tools to organize his ideas, ways to permute themes and create variations almost geometrically, but the melodic genius was all George. You can't teach that kind of invention with a formula.
And the honors just kept coming, even decades after he was gone.
Oh yes, a posthumous Pulitzer Prize in 1998 for his body of work, the Congressional Gold Medal, there's a Gershwin Theater on Broadway, and maybe most importantly, think about the sheer volume of jazz standards he created. I Got Rhythm, Embraceable You, Someone to Watch Over Me.
These songs became the absolute bedrock of jazz improvisation.
That's the beautiful irony, isn't it? The jazz musicians who came after him, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, they took his popular songs and used them as the playground for their own radical inventions.
The rhythm changes.
The rhythm changes. The chord progression from his song I Got Rhythm is the second most common chord progression in all of jazz history, right after the 12-bar blues. Every single bebop player had to know it inside and out. He literally provided the framework for the next generation.
So let's try and synthesize all this. We started by calling him the soundtrack of the nation. But looking back at his life, the tenement kid, the song plugger, the imposter who wanted to study with the masters, what's the big takeaway for you?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Gershwin represents the promise and the reality of American cultural fluidity. He simply did not see a wall between high art and low art. He didn't see why a pop song couldn't have the complexity of a symphony or why an opera couldn't have the rhythms of a jazz club.
He broke the rules because he never really learned them in the traditional way to begin with.
He was the ultimate crossover artist before that was even a term. And that, of course, brings us to the great what if.
The big one. Dying at 38. I mean, Porgy and Bess was only 1935. He died in 37. He was just beginning to scratch the surface of these larger, more complex forms.
If you look at the musical timeline, he died just before the explosion of bebop. He died before the golden age of the LP record, before the rise of the modern musical as we know it with Rodgers and Hammerstein. Imagine Gershwin in the 1950s.
Imagine Gershwin reacting to Elvis, reacting to rock and roll.
Would he have embraced it? I think he would have been fascinated by it. He was always chasing the sound of the now. He believed music had to reflect its time. I truly believe that if he had lived another 20 or 30 years, he might have bridged that gap between classical and popular music permanently.
We might not even have those distinctions today.
A chasm might not be so wide. He was the closest we ever got to a unified field theory of American music.
That is a fascinating and kind of a sad thought. A world where the symphony hall and the pop chart are one and the same.
He was the one who could have built that bridge.
Well, on that note, I want to encourage everyone listening. Go back and put on Rhapsody in Blue. But don't just let it be background music. Really listen for the taxi horns. Listen for the train rhythms. Listen for the street kid from Brooklyn who got the entire world to listen to his tune.
It's always worth a fresh listen.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.